Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Ramblings of a Madman. And I'm very privileged and honoured to be joined by the nice-ish psychologist, otherwise known as Dan. And given the nature of Dan's job, I'm not sure how much else I can ask about him personally, or he wants to divulge on here anyway. But I think the perfect place for us to start would be because I've had this nagging question, Dan,
Yeah.
and it is Ramblings of a Madman, pretty self-stigmatizing, right?
Yeah.
Do I get a pass for that for making a joke at my own mental health?
So yeah, I guess I think I think it's one of those things where sort of, there's a lot of memes and stuff on social media where people sort of make light of certain sort of, mental health statuses, I guess. Um, and I guess, it's whatever kind of however you help, however you kind of conceptualize and cope with things. I think it's quite okay to kind of um, be a bit sort of irreverent with things, but particularly when they pertain to yourself. I think it's when you start to denigrate and sort of hold other people in some kind of lesser value based on their mental health status. I think that's where you get into kind of tricky territory. But I guess if you kind of consider yourself in that respect, and because and also you ramble, then I guess it's whatever you want to call yourself.
Well, I just thought if nothing else, it does exactly what it says on the tin, right?
Yeah. And so actually, I was saying to my partner, I said, she said, "Who are you talking to today?" So I said, "Well, I'm a guest on Dan Osman's podcast." And she said, "Who's that?" And I said, "We've done a podcast together." And she said, "What's his called?" And I said, "Well, it's called The Ramblings of a Madman." So she went, "Ramblings of a Madman," and then you do the nicest Ramblings podcast. So it's just two people who like to chat. And I said, "Yeah, absolutely."
That's what it is, isn't it? Podcast, just people who like to just talk and ramble.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, if nothing else, it is just people who have views that they think other people might give enough of a shit about to listen to. Sometimes that might be a bit hubristic and maybe a bit narcissistic in some sense. Oh, narcissistic. No, we'll get onto that in a second. Um, but yeah, there's people
Yeah.
just liking to have a chat.
Thank you once again for joining us. And just for I mean, I only really have more of an insight into this just from probably the last year. You are by trade, it's not a trade, it's more a vocation. You are a forensic psychologist. For the sake of the listener, what is a forensic psychologist and why does the
Um,
world need them?
well, technically, I'm a forensic and a clinical psychologist, so I'm duly qualified in both.
Okay, I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's fine, don't worry. It's not an issue of pride or anything. It's just I guess the reason why I highlighted it is because I actually straddle both disciplines of psychology within the field within the sort of areas that I work. So um I guess a forensic psychologist, first and foremost, is about sort of trying to understand why people engage in offending behavior. It's to sort of understand the reasons why they may have made some of the choices that they have had in their life. And then obviously using all the research that exists within the particular field of psychology, trying to understand um, how they may have come to a certain point in their life to sort of make those choices, and then I guess to kind of then help them understand, how they got to where they are, and then sort of thinking about what it is that they need in order to make different choices. Um, and that can in and of itself, that seems like a very simplistic explanation, but that in and of itself can be quite challenging for various reasons. Systems in which the people grow up in, the prison system itself, the particular difficulties that somebody might have that sort of led them to be involved in a life of offending, whether that be significant trauma history, I guess like the socioeconomic environment in which they grow up in, the sort of nature of the family dynamics that they grew up in, the I guess the associates that they may have, um, to name a few. And I guess we kind of have to try and unpick all of that and sort of essentially help somebody understand that what they did had consequences, but maybe in given the context in which they grew up in or the life that they led, maybe made sense as to why they would have done what they did. But then sort of, helping them understand, again, like I said, the consequences not only for themselves, but for the victims. May there be some victims? There usually is. There's no such thing as a victimless crime, as they say. But then thinking about how to actually sort of take the next steps forward. Then sort of alongside that, being a clinical psychologist, part and parcel of the work that I do is to try and think about how somebody's mental health or sort of clinical psychological difficulties might tie into their risk. So I work exclusively with people who would, I guess, be labeled with diagnoses of personality disorder. I know that that's a fairly controversial term. Some people agree with it, some people don't. But for all intents and purposes, I basically work with people whose personality character traits are, to such an extent that it causes difficulties for themselves and other people around them. And in this instance, and in these instances, would most likely have contributed to their kind of offending pattern of behavior. So I guess the work that I do tries to sort of marry the understanding of risk that somebody poses, the clinical presentations that they might have, and the origins of those, again, sort of, generally rooted in specifically the population that I work in. But I would argue that most of the prison population have some kind of significant trauma history, but that would be rooted in that, and then potentially sort of coupled with certain aspects of neurodivergence as well. So sometimes I work with people who have aspects of ASD traits, or sort of more along sort of like the disordered side of things. Also ADHD, but that's sort of, and then you got to try and think about how that contributes to the way in which they see the world, how they see themselves, the sort of difficulties with, I guess, focus or impulse control that they might have. But yeah, so kind of combining those two sort of elements of psychological disciplines, I sort of work with people to try and help them live different lives and make different choices, essentially, and choices that will hopefully lead them to not kind of make the same choices that got them to the point where they are in their life now.
So obviously it's fair to say it's fairly complex work.
Yeah.
Which
Yes.
I think that kind of leads on to many of the conversations we've had, actually, because in a day and age of social media and just this almost this informed approach to thinking, and everything hashtagged and everything reduced into a soundbite, we see much of this, I guess, flippant terminology, which is kind of what brought us onto that conversation of the use of binge. Certainly within the industry that I work with, people will flippantly say binge, whereas often there's a big distinction between binge eating disorder and there's someone that's just a binge on a Netflix series, for example. And one that's popped up and does frequently pop up is triggered. And often when we talk about triggered, which I'd love for you to expand on, but I see it kind of described as my mild annoyance at something is described as triggered. Is that triggered? And obviously, I'm hugely conscious that we can't remove people's personal experiences from this as well. So something that could be triggering to someone else might be to someone quite mild, something quite benign and not important. So I don't want to remove anyone's personal experience from that. But when we talk about triggering, especially in relation to actual trauma, I wondered whether you could just give us a broad overview of what that is to help better people understand that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I guess so. Again, sort of like what you're saying, I'm very cautious about having this conversation because I guess, as you've identified, with the sort of advent of social media, discussions around mental health difficulties have become a lot more common. The conversations are happening a lot more frequently. There's a lot more, there's a lot less, I guess, aversion or I can't think of the word, but people are a bit more emboldened to talk about things on social media, particularly around the fact that there's a lot more, I guess, psychology/mental health accounts that kind of try and make this information a bit more accessible, which I think is obviously fantastic and great. And I think the more information out there, the better. The better. But I guess kind of what you're talking about, and I've looked it up on Wikipedia because I think I've mentioned this to you before. I think what's happening is there's this idea of what's called concept creep, which is something that was identified by somebody called Nick Haslam in 2016, which basically, you can go look it up on Wikipedia. If you type in concept creep, you can have a look for it yourself. But it's basically this idea that there are sort of harm-related terms, particularly around within the sort of field of psychology, that have kind of, I guess, for all intents and purposes, remained kind of within the field, as it were. So there was this sort of vernacular or terminology or way of speaking that was understood amongst professionals within the field, and those terms have become more accessible and popularized within social media. But at the same time, whilst they become more accessible and they become a little bit more within the zeitgeist, within sort of like social media and all that kind of stuff, the notion or the understanding of what the concepts original meanings were have shifted slightly, or are starting to shift, and are maybe starting to encompass things that maybe aren't originally intended to fall within the term. So an example is what you're talking about in the sense of triggers or being triggered. Now, the word trigger is associated within the field of sort of psychology and mental health, firstly with trauma, but then also with sort of like the onset of a psychological difficulty. So when we think about somebody's psychological distress, so say, for example, if somebody has, to use an example, somebody has developed schizophrenia. For anybody that doesn't know what schizophrenia is, it's a form of psychosis where, for all intents and purposes, somebody essentially becomes out of touch with reality. So you start to hear voices, you start to see things, you start to believe things that are kind of outside the realms of what we would understand reality to be. So there might be sort of quite significant paranoia, thinking that things are happening to you when they may not be. Quite a common trope of schizophrenia is thinking that sort of like people are listening to you through, like, or speaking to you through the TV, or people are listening to you through sort of electronic devices and things like that. Okay. Now, the thing with mental health difficulties is that you kind of formulate how somebody got to that point. So when I talked about earlier, trying to understand somebody's mental health difficulties to help them understand how they got to where they are, we do that by sort of gathering a lot of information and assessing them, and then creating what is essentially a formulation, which is essentially a best fit narrative around a person's life that kind of takes them from sort of birth up until this point, and sort of thinks about all the significant points in their life that may have contributed to the psychological difficulty or mental health illness that somebody, the mental illness that somebody has. And within the formulation, we'll sometimes talk about triggers, and those will generally be like key events. So things that kind of precipitated somebody's mental health decline. So again, things like, well, it's kind of broken down more into sort of like predisposing factors. So predisposing factors would be things in somebody's life that kind of predisposes them to potentially developing a mental illness. So those can be things that are related to either their biological or genetic makeup, their social environment growing up, how they develop psychologically, which would obviously then be sort of formed and shaped by their social sort of environment, and that can relate to parenting, schooling, again, sort of the class, again, sort of the class status that somebody might have, the socioeconomic environment that they may grow up in. There's a whole raft of things that could kind of develop as predisposing. But then what we think about is just before somebody develops a mental illness, so either depression, severe anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, all those kind of things. Usually there is something that kind of, I guess, is like a bit of a breaking point, sort of like a straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing, where all those predisposing sort of factors create almost like a bit of a perfect storm. And then there's almost like this one event, whether that be some kind of stressor. Sometimes that's sort of a bereavement, that's an additional trauma that somebody experiences. Maybe that's, job pressures, a relationship breakdown, any number of things, which kind of then almost sort of tip somebody into this state of psychological distress. So we sometimes refer to that as a trigger. So we talk about that as a precipitating factor. So a trigger, something that triggered off this psychological distress. That's one sort of version of trigger. The other version of trigger, which is commonly sort of discussed within sort of psychology and mental health, is kind of what you alluded to in relation to trauma. And here I'm talking about sort of, all kinds of trauma. So there's what we call one-off traumas. So I've just got a list here of things that could potentially be one-off traumas. Well, firstly, I guess a trauma, there's lots of various different sort of definitions for trauma. From as simple as a negative event or a stressor, right down to I've got a definition here where it says like a wider set of experiences or events that can happen at any time of life, includes some of the adversities that can be experienced in childhood, which are known as ACEs, and I can talk about that a little bit more if you'd like. And they can be emotionally or physically harmful or life-threatening events. Okay, so when we talk about, I say we talk about trauma within the mental health field, that's kind of the thing that we tend to focus on. And we'll come back to concept creep in relation to trauma in a little while as well, because that's also another term that seems to, for better or worse, I'm not entirely sure, but that seems to be kind of broadening as well. But we can maybe talk about that in a second if you want to as well. But I guess when we talk about traumatic events, there's sort of single event or acute one-off traumas, which can be things like, a robbery, a mugging, a sexual assault, a physical assault, something like a natural disaster, being a victim of a terrorist event, accidents, so vehicular accidents, being involved in a car crash, bereavements, medically induced traumas, so going through, having like an operation or something like that, which, goes wrong, or, sometimes people talk about sort of being under anesthetic and they kind of wake up midway through an operation. That can be quite traumatic. And then I guess sort of somebody close to you dying as well. So those are kind of one-off traumas. Then you get what's called, I guess, could potentially be thought of as more prolonged, chronic, or I guess what's being more understood as complex trauma. And those, and again, those are also vary quite a lot. So those that can fall under sort of things like racism, stigmatization, again, poverty, immigration, sexual exploitation, which I guess is like prolonged sexual violence, social disadvantage, growing up in violent neighborhoods, being in prison and confined for long periods of time, chronic bullying, and I guess critical and really overbearing parents, so quite neglectful, overbearing, really harsh parenting, social isolation, and things like that. So I guess when we talk about trauma, that's kind of those things. And I guess, it's not necessarily that's what I've just sort of talked about, is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but I suppose those are kind of the things that we talk about when we talk about trauma. Now, when we talk about a trigger, what we mean is we talk about something that is a reminder of that particular trauma, or of those particular traumas that you might have experienced. Okay. Which is very different to, as you were saying, the type of use of trigger, which I guess is becoming a little bit more common. And I agree. I saw a post the other day on social media. I can't remember who it was by, and that's not really important, but I guess somebody put something up on their stories, and it said, if you're triggered by this, then you need to kind of like examine yourself or look at yourself and all that kind of stuff. And I read it and I was like, I get what you're saying, but actually, if you substituted the word trigger for, if you're annoyed by this, if you're offended by this, if you are mildly discomforted by this, if this sits unpleasantly with you, then you need to figure that out. And that's not the same as like a trauma trigger. Like a trauma trigger is something that will almost like viscerally remind you of the experience that you've
Mm.
had, and it will kind of you know, so to expand on that, so when we talk about the the one-off and the complex types of trauma, they develop, what develops from those depending on the nature of the trauma and whether actually somebody is traumatized by the event, which is also something that sort of seems to be taken for granted, really, I guess, within the sort
Mm.
of social media conversations, is that people can experience trauma, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are traumatized. And to be traumatized means to be significantly impacted by the event. Okay. So for somebody that's gone through sort of the more complex type of trauma, so things like, let's go for trying to think of something that's unpleasant, but not necessarily massively, I guess, difficult to listen to, I suppose. Let's go back to the list. Okay, bullying. Okay, let's take bullying. So, bullying is fairly common. It's something that can happen, and it's something that sort of shapes people's views of themselves. I guess when people experience the more complex traumas, one is more likely to end up being traumatized, because I guess that's quite chronic. The idea behind complex trauma is the fact that one is exposed to the stressor or the event, and to the point where like escape almost feels impossible, or it feels consistently unrelenting and is always there. So it's people talk about, well, it's been more recognized now within the sort of domestic violence, sort of understanding of domestic violence, that children who grow up in domestically violent households will probably develop sort of complex trauma traits, because actually that kind of home environment is a chronic stressor. So living under constant fear of threat of, not even necessarily for a child to be receive physical assault, but just witnessing either parents being assaulted or abused in some way, that just growing up in that environment can be chronically stressful, and to the point where it's traumatizing. The one-off traumas, so your car accidents, your natural disasters, things like that, it's not necessarily a given that somebody will be traumatized by that. And I guess what determines whether somebody will be traumatized or not, or just experience a trauma and kind of bounce back, which is not to say that they won't be affected, but I guess what they will do is they will kind of, I don't know, process that as part of their life, integrate it into sort of their being, and kind of find ways to move forward in some
Mm.
respect, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Um,
because sorry to interrupt you there, because I'm always very conscious is like this is hugely into individual,
yeah,
and you always want to be, well, I like to be, I think, as a mental health advocate, open the space for a safe platform for people to openly discuss these things, as they
yeah,
should be. People should be more comfortable, but at the same time, it's a lot of it's pathologizing just basic human experience. And
exactly, yeah,
as you said, is it diagnosable anxiety disorder, or is it just experiencing angst? Is it sadness, or is it depression? And they use so interchangeably. I think it's perfectly understandable why people get confused, which is why I think
mhm,
this is such a valuable discussion to have.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you're right, sort of. And I guess part of the reason why I sort of started this conversation by saying I want to talk about this with caution is because trauma and people's experiences of trauma, or what they might consider traumatizing or traumatic, is subjective. That's one of the whole things about trauma, is that it's about whether you found the experience to be overwhelming, stressful, life-threatening, whether you thought that you were going to die, or whether you thought your life was perpetually in jeopardy, or something along those lines. Um, you know, so some people might, with a one-off with a one-off sort of trauma, some people might think, some people, my own experience is that I was in a car crash when I was about 18, 19. And for a very long time, I was very skittish around cars.
Hmm.
I was okay driving them, but being a passenger, I was very sort of quite nervous. And I now know that I was traumatized by the fact that I was in a car crash. But at the time, I didn't really know that much because, you know, again, this is why these conversations being out in the public are a lot more are really helpful, because obviously it potentially would have given me some idea that this is something that I've experienced. Um, but um, but for somebody else, so say, for example, if you were in a car crash and you experienced the same car crash, actually, you might have just been like, oh, Jesus Christ, that was an insane fucking experience. I nearly died, but actually, I'm all right. You know, life is good, life carries on, and you'd be all right. And the difference between our experiences is around sort of both our internal resilience and the way in which we make sense about the trauma that we experienced, whether we think that it was a near-death experience and what that means to us. So for me, that was like, oh my God, I nearly died. I could possibly die again. Cars are really scary. They're just pieces of, you know, they're essentially just boxes where we drive around at like 70, 80, 90 miles an hour. And actually that's just madness. Whereas for you, you could probably just be like, oh, that was a pretty intense experience that's made me really appreciate life a little bit more. I'm probably going to be a bit more cautious on the roads, but actually, you know, life is important. I need to just live my life a little bit more safely. But that's about how you and I, for the various different ways in which we've come to understand the world, will make sense of that trauma. But then there's also the external resiliency that we have. So the support that gathers around us post trauma. So, you know, again, my experience might be shaped by the fact that I was maybe the only person in the car. My parents were not necessarily didn't give a shit, and this is just me making it, by the way. My parents really, they were there, they were around me, they gave me great support. But I'm just speaking hypothetically. So, say for example, if I didn't have any support, no one really cared about the fact that I almost died. They were just like, it's a car crash. You know, people own car crashes all the time. They're more common than plane crashes, whatever. You're more likely to be eaten by a shark, whatever they say. That would be potentially really invalidating for me, and that would potentially sort of impact on how I then make sense of the trauma. Whereas for you, if you had a similar car crash and people sort of gathered around you, showed you lots of love, showed you lots of support, assisted you, helped you make sense of it, process it, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff, then you will again make sense of the trauma in a different way, and it'll be a different experience for you. And external support sort of is you know, has various different layers. There's obviously your immediate family, there's your partners, your friends, then there's the, I guess, social support around you, hospitals, mental health support systems, all that kind of stuff. Then there's kind of the societal support, and you know, support sort of expands outwards in that way. And depending on who you are as a person and what your support, your external resilience looks like in terms of that, you will experience things in a particular way.
Yeah, I'm nodding my head in agreement there, because I think of so many different things, and when you're talking about almost the disparity in the levels of support, is straight away springs to mind is the British government and support of people in lower socio-economically deprived areas. And
Absolutely.
when we're talking about mental health considerations, financial factors come into that. We're talking epigenetics and the perfect storm, as you kind of reference. But within that, and everyone else's individual experience, I guess one thing I did really want to explore was, you mentioned this real visceral response in people and how much that can affect them. And again, when we talk about happy, clappy mental health, which I do see hugely positive things of that on social media, don't get me wrong, but I think it often comes from a place of privilege when you can pick your hardest bouts, if you like. So if your way of ticking your mental health box is doing a cold plunge in the morning, so be it. There are people that are working 2-3 jobs to feed their families, whatever. So it's hugely subjective from that point of view. But when we're talking about quality of life and how debilitating that can be for some people, what does that look like in your clinical experience? How can that look like?
As in, like, you know, what is it, I suppose, what does it look like when somebody is
Yeah, so
consistently
I
sort
guess
of
when
traumatized and activated and things like that?
when someone, I use a flippant example here, someone may say, oh, you know, respond to something on social media, and someone's response to that, counter to whatever argument is placed in front of them, is, oh, someone's triggered. That's very different to debilitating quality of life that someone that, you know, you may be working with experience.
So again, to kind of talk about like what what it means to be traumatized, and to then have a trigger which will then sort of activate those trauma responses. I guess, one of the ways in which we try and understand how somebody is understood to be traumatized is through sort of their responses post the traumatic event. And I guess when we talk about single one-off events, we tend to sort of talk about PTSD, and I know people might roll their eyes and be like, "Oh my God, trauma doesn't just mean PTSD," and I agree. Like, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that everybody who has a traumatic experiences a trauma will have PTSD again, because I don't believe that everybody that experiences trauma goes on to be traumatized. But if somebody is traumatized, they will probably experience some of the symptoms that might align with the diagnosis of PTSD, which would include things like a continued sense of threat. So when somebody is traumatized by something that they, was really overwhelming of their senses, sort of overtook their sort of capacity to think about whether they might survive a situation, the sense of threat is always prevalent in there. So for me, when I was in a car, the sense of threat was like, oh my God, this car at any point in time could probably crash, or this driver that I'm sitting next to is probably terrible and they're gonna, crash the car. So the sense of threat is sort of, cognitive, it's on your mind, it's there, but it's also really felt within your body. So, feeling really tense, really sweaty. We talk about your autonomic nervous system, so your sympathetic nervous system, that the fight flight part of your body being continuously activated. So there will be that, and that's you. So when we talk about triggered, that's usually what we're talking about happening. Is there is a visceral, bodily, cognitive, psychological, physiological response to something that reminds you of the trauma. So for me, for a very long time, it was being in a car, particularly being a passenger in a car. My heart would race. I would just be sitting there hoping and praying that the car journey would end fairly soon. I had like, thinking about it now, I can laugh about it now, but when I was driving in a car, and I'd be in the passenger seat, and cars would go past me, or people would drive quite close to, I don't know, like concrete barriers or whatever. I would worry so much that they were going to hit it, that I would literally I would pull away from the passenger seat door, I'd almost like literally clench my arse cheeks, being like in fear of like, oh my God, this car's going to hit. And so that's because I was sitting like in a trigger, basically. Like I was riding shotgun in one of my triggers. So when we talk about a trigger, we talk about quite a visceral response. But then one of the other things related that we might sort of consider a trauma response would be like avoidance of the things that would trigger us. So, no one wants to be reminded of these things that happen to us. So the natural thing to want to do is to avoid it. And that, again, can be cognitive. So you avoid thinking about it. And then physically, you would avoid either going to places, talking about it. So for me, I couldn't necessarily avoid getting in a car, but sort of, if I could, I would potentially drive. Like, so if we had to go somewhere, I would say, yeah, I'll drive rather than be a passenger. But then actually, when I was a passenger, I would be shitting bricks, literally. So there's, so that's one of the things that we think about is avoiding things. But then also there's a sense of re-experiencing, and this is something that I didn't experience. I didn't have nightmares, flashbacks, things like that. But people who, would typically be given a diagnosis of PTSD, that's what they have. And again, sort of when we talk about triggers, so flashbacks and nightmares can be triggers, but then also triggers can then trigger nightmares, flashbacks. And when we talk about flashbacks, it's often talked about like physically being right back in the situation that you were in. It's like almost like you're being transported back in time to the moment where whatever happened to you happened to you. And so that's kind of like for the one-off event. So when we talk about sort of the more complex side of things, it includes the sense of threat, the avoidance, and the re-experiencing, but it also includes sort of difficulties with emotional regulation. So because people who have complex trauma are often exposed to that trauma for so long, they don't quite know how to manage or regulate the situations because themselves or situations, because the sense of threat is always there. Sometimes they are safe, but then sometimes they're not, and the sense of threat and the avoidance adds to that. So they will just be really up and down. They will be really I guess we talk about clinically, we talk about what's called emotional lability. So being emotionally labile. So your emotions can go from one extreme to the other. So you can be extremely angry to sort of extremely sort of sad and low and that kind of thing. But even people who may have, for lack of a better phrase, less slightly less traumatizing responses to complex trauma might not necessarily have quite such severe emotional dysregulation, but there might be people who are quite hot-tempered, easily sort of angered, or easily moody. Their moods can change almost like on a switch. They can be one way 1 second, and then just all of a sudden their mood is shifted quite palpably. And then they will definitely have sort of like a negative self-concept. So they'll have difficulties with their self-identity. They will think that they are typically a bad person, or that they deserved what happened to them in some respect, or that what they did in their life meant that the thing that happened to them was some kind of punishment and was they were deserving of that in some way. And they have really so low self-esteem, low self-worth, low self-value, and don't necessarily consider themselves to be I guess people worthy of any kind of consideration. And then what you have with all of that is interpersonal difficulties, because I guess somebody who is emotionally dysregulated, who is really hypervigilant to threat, always trying to avoid situations that may trigger their trauma responses.
Distrusting, problems with
Yeah,
relationships.
exactly. That just naturally creates difficulties in relating to other people, and that and that's not just in sort of intimate relationships, but that can be between family, friends, work colleagues. It just makes it really difficult for that person to kind of just trust other people and essentially trust that somebody's not going to harm them or hurt them in some way.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, because the reason why I feel this is almost quite poignant this time of year is that when we talk about trauma, especially, thank you for that as such a perfect explanation, I think, and something that I think everyone can relate to on some level as well, whether they can associate that with being long-term traumatized or experiencing trauma at some point in their lives. But I recorded a solo podcast a couple of weeks back on body image and these uncomfortable conversations that often crop up with bumping into maybe family members and friends that you don't see that often, but can bring about some of these visceral experiences in bodies. So I thought it'd be quite interesting to kind of explore navigating difficult family dynamics in which there may be something. And by the way, I don't expect you to have all the answers here, but just broadly, like some kind of advice for people that may be socializing, seeing friends and family they haven't seen for a while, maybe difficult conversations they've never been able to have cropping up, having some sort of exploratory journey later on in life, and which brings about this self-awareness and all these conversations they do want to have, but they know maybe aren't worth having.
So yeah, it's a tough time of year, isn't it? For some people, for some it's really joyous time, but for other people, I guess some of what I've talked about in terms of where the difficulties in someone's life occurs from quite often can occur within a family dynamic. Maybe not necessarily to the point where somebody will have complex PTSD symptoms, but certainly there might be some difficulties around avoidance, not necessarily feeling very comfortable around particular people because of whatever reason. And I suppose it's really tricky, isn't it? Because I guess my first thing to say would be, if there's anybody who you're potentially going to see this festive season, who kind of brings that up for you. Like if you were to think about them and they kind of make, physically in your body or cognitively in your mind, you have, you know, some kind of adverse response to thinking about that person. I guess what you want to try and think about long term is, how are you going to navigate that person, being around that person in the future? Because I guess if you've made plans to see them this Christmas, you probably can't do much about it now. Although, I guess you can. We all have choices about what we want to do. But I guess because I knew we were gonna sort of discuss this, and I guess one of the things that I thought that could be quite helpful for people is, so I'm a DBT therapist. I'm trained as a DBT therapist. So it's that stands for Dialectical Behaviour Therapy, and it's typically used with individuals who have high levels of self-harm and suicidality, and it's about trying to help them cope with their self-harm and suicidal behaviors in a way that leads them to not self-harm or want to try and attempt to take their life. But the skills that are taught are actually generally quite applicable to people in everyday life. Like, there are certain things that I've learned from the therapy that I think are really sort of gold in terms of trying to manage your own life and things like that. And within DBT, there's a module called interpersonal effectiveness, and within that is something called the Dear Man skill. You can go look it up on Google or anything like that. It's really
I'll add
sort of,
something to the show notes as well to
yeah,
prompt
yeah.
people.
And I guess within DBT as a whole, DBT is about trying to help people make decisions about how they want to solve a problem. Okay. And usually within DBT, the problem is, not wanting to harm yourself or sort of, try and make attempts on your life. But essentially, you can apply this kind of thinking to any kind of problem, really. But within DBT, there's usually what we think about, there's 4 solutions to a problem. So the first one is that you can solve the problem. Okay. So if you can solve the problem, try and solve it. And, there are various, and how you solve it will be very specific to what the problem is. So thinking about family dynamics, difficult family members, difficult family times, if you can solve that problem between now and when you see them on Christmas Day or Boxing Day or over the festive period, try and do that. What that looks like is entirely dependent on the situation. Not going to the event is a solution to the problem. So completely taking yourself away from the situation, if that's something that you feel will solve the problem and save you a whole lot of sort of emotional difficulty or angst or anything like that, that is one option. We would probably call that like avoidance problem solving, but times are tough. There's only like less than just over a week until Christmas, so like needs must, do what you need to do. But I guess if you could solve the problem, then that's one way to do it. The other thing is to change how you feel about the problem. So try and reevaluate the situation in a way that kind of makes sense to you, or in a way that will help you kind of get through the situation in a way that's best serves your own needs. Okay. So, can you sort of do some pros and cons about whether it's worth going to see these family members or this family member, or is it worth engaging this person in a conversation, and what are your personal limits about how much you engage in with these particular people? Like, are you willing to say hello to them? Are you willing to be civil with them? Can you just have a normal when I say normal conversation, I mean like superficial conversations with them, or can you engage with them in a slightly more in-depth way? Or do you can you go to wherever it is that you're going, but just sort of say hi and then just not speak to them for the rest of the day, week, whatever it is? But I guess kind of within sort of changing how you feel about a situation, there's sort of that involves sort of emotional regulation skills. So things like acting opposite. So if you have to, can you just grit your teeth and just put on a smile and just talk to the person for 5 minutes that you need to, or is that intolerable? So that's one thing you can do, change how you feel. The other thing is to try and tolerate or accept the situation as it is. You know, if there's nothing that you can do about it, can you just, for however long, accept, tolerate, put up with the situation for as long as needs be? Like, and again, this is where you kind of weigh up the situations, because again, this is all subjective, isn't it? So is it like your partner's parents, and maybe they're not necessarily the nicest people, but for the sake of your partner, you will just have to kind of put up with whatever it is? Is it, you know, is it your grandparents and they're maybe slightly overbearing, but actually just for the sake of your kids who you want to just let them have a nice Christmas, can you just sit and tolerate and you know, do what you need to do? And I guess when we think about tolerating, we think about trying to plan ahead. So planning what you will do, how you will cope with it. We think about self-soothing. So are there ways in which you can kind of make yourself feel better? And, you know, I don't necessarily want to advocate for the use of alcohol, but I guess sometimes for some people, sort of, you know, having a beer or two just kind of calms the situation down, unless it's something that aggravates the situation, in which case don't do it. But I guess, you know, can you try and focus on your children's joy? Can you like kind of focus on the fact that it's for them and you're trying to make them have a happy Christmas, which can kind of like, you know, supersede whatever difficulties it is that you're experiencing within the family dynamic? And then the fourth option is to stay miserable. So, you know, that's your choice as well. You can either choose to do none of the above, and you can just be like, this is going to be shit. I'm just going to go be miserable. It's 1 day a year, 2 days a year, whatever, and just stick it out. And yeah, I guess that's kind of, I know that's not necessarily the most beneficial or
No, I
universal
think that's
advice.
hugely helpful, and I think, you know, as you said, within that as well, it depends on the severity, right? It's, can you tolerate it, or is it? I think there's also difficult conversations around perhaps something you realize later in life. Are these people best for me and those
Yeah,
around me, or
yeah,
am I tolerating this for the wrong reasons? I think I
yeah,
could certainly relate to that. Maybe this whole, you know, blood and all that, and you don't get to pick your family and everything else, and you kind of work out that you're tolerating behavior you wouldn't accept elsewhere, but actually for
mm,
reasons that aren't to the benefit of you and those you most
yeah,
love.
yeah.
Again,
And I
hugely.
guess it's exactly that, isn't it? So the other thing that I sort of struggle with just a little bit, I can understand where it comes from, but I guess it's also not necessarily quite so easy, or it's not, it just seems to be a slightly knee-jerk reaction sort of way of thinking about it, is where they're just like, cut people out of your life. And I'm like, okay, what has the person done to you in your life that requires them to be cut out? Like, if they're horrifically abusive, they're awful, they're just not nice people, they make you feel disgusting, scared, petrified, all that kind of stuff, then yes, probably they're not the best person to be around, and you could probably do without that person in your life. If they're just like an annoying uncle who, you know,
Didn't send me a Christmas card.
yeah, that kind of thing. Like, do you need to cut that person out of your life, or actually, can you have a conversation with that person and be like, do you know what? For the last couple of years, this is how I felt. Oh, and this is where the dear man skill comes in, by the way. You know, there is the option of having conversations with people. So the dear man skill sets out several sort of ways in which to kind of have conversations. And I know it sounds really what's the word I'm looking for? Condescending, maybe, but it's not. It's, you know, like trying to teach
I
people
don't
about how
think
to have.
so. I think these are skills we take for granted that people have,
Yeah,
communication skills. But I always see the positive in that is that's always something we can enhance. That's always something, a
yeah,
skill we can learn and get better at over time.
exactly. So, you know, so the dear man skills are an acronym for seven. Is it seven steps to kind of having an effective conversation. So the D stands for describing the situation in a simple way. Okay. So, you know, if it's an uncle that's not sent you a Christmas card, it's saying, you know, Uncle John, for 7 years now, you've not sent me any Christmas cards. Okay. So that's explaining the situation. Then the E stands for expressing how you feel using I statements. So you've not sent me Christmas cards for 7 years, and that makes me feel like you don't like me, or that I've done something wrong to you, and it makes me feel quite sad. Then the A stands for like asserting, either by asking for your need or saying firmly no, depending on the situation. So it would, you know, it would make me feel really good if you could send me a Christmas card this year, because actually you're my favorite uncle, and it would make me feel really nice if you sent me a Christmas card. And then the R is for reinforcing, so making sure that the other person knows, because I guess kind of there needs to be a bit of a benefit to other people when you're sort of having these conversations. It's not just about you. So, you know, so the thing that I struggle with the cut people off completely narrative is that, and I say this very tentatively, because again, I'm not talking about extremely abusive or horrible situations, but human beings are relational, right? So it's not just somebody always doing something to you. There is something about us as well, whether it's conscious or unconscious, intended or unintended, that kind of creates the dynamic that exists. And which is why you kind of use these sort of techniques to kind of explore that, because if it is something about you that you don't know that you're doing, you don't know that you've done, or that, or way that somebody views you or thinks about you or holds you in mind in some way, again, that's not your fault. It's not to say that you've done this intentionally or purposefully, but the reason why somebody behaves towards you has something to do with you as a person.
Yeah. Do you know what this? Do you know what this makes me think of? All the, again, Instagram is the people that describe everyone else as red flags, whereas you kind of think that, hang on, there's a common denominator here. If everyone else is a red flag.
Yeah. So, you know, sort of they use the example of a guy who apparently dates crazy women, and I use crazy in inverted commas, where he says all my ex-girlfriends were crazy, and it's like, were they crazy, or was there something about you that kind of brought, you know, made them act to you in a certain way? And yeah, so I guess it's, again, it's not so when I say that there is, the interactions are relational and they're two-way, it's not about sort of, I'm not saying that anybody's done something purposefully. I'm not trying to say that you are to blame for how somebody else behaves towards you. If they behave towards you horribly, that's on them as well. Like they need to take responsibility for that. But what I'm saying is that there is something in the interaction, consciously or unconsciously, between you and another person that creates the dynamic between you. So they behave towards you in a particular way for a particular reason, and that has something to do with you as a person. For example, it might just be that you're an overly bubbly, really nice person, and actually some people find overly bubbly, gregarious people really fucking annoying sometimes, and actually no one really wants to talk to somebody who's really effervescent and overly bubbly. So what people might do is just avoid you and be like, I actually don't want to talk to that person because they're quite a lot. So rather, I'm just going to go and spend some, you know, they talk too much, they talk really loudly, they talk really animatedly, and actually that's just a bit draining for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm probably just going to like avoid them, and if I see them, I'm just going to wave to them, and I'm just going to go have a drink there by myself. Now, you as the person who's very effervescent and bubbly and really excited to see other people might see that and be like, well, that person's an arsehole. Why don't they want to talk to me? That's just not, they're just not a nice person.
Totally.
So it's that kind of thing. It's like, you know, you haven't intentionally tried to alienate them with your effervescence and bubbliness and gregariousness. It's just the way in which that person receives how you are, maybe just doesn't gel with them. But if you communicate, sorry.
No, I was just going to say the great thing about this is even if that other person doesn't necessarily have the courage or the ability to instigate this conversation, by instigating this conversation yourself, it opens up the platform to have this exchange. It gives either person permission to have their say as well, but not from a shouting and hollering point of view.
Yeah, exactly. I've noticed that when I come say hi to you, you kind of tend to just wave hello, and then you kind of seem to go off, and that makes me feel like I've done something wrong, or I'm not. It leaves me a bit confused actually, because I thought we were friends. So I was wondering, could we have a bit of a discussion about what's going on? Because I'd really like to, be your friend, and I don't quite, I don't like that we don't speak to each other, and all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And yeah, so I guess, so you describe, you express, you assert, you reinforce the sort of the things that you want. And then the man part of the Dear Man is about sort of being mindful, so not becoming distracted by things. So if somebody tries to veer off topic of conversation and try and derail you and say, oh yeah, no, that's fine, well, let's have a beer, and you're like, oh no, actually, I just want to just double check and clarify that we're on the same page and all that kind of stuff. So don't be distracted by it. Appear confident regardless of how you might feel, because um helps. And I'm not saying that it's really easy. It's not an easy thing to do, and again, depending on who you're having a conversation with, the confidence you might feel in having that conversation may vary. And then I guess negotiate as well, like, try and see things from other people's perspectives, try and sort of give some wiggle room for negotiation, because again, in the example about the effervescent slash person who's, again, okay, let's call them the extrovert versus the introvert. So the introverted person isn't just suddenly overnight going to be an introverted person and just be like, oh yeah, sorry, let's have 10,000 conversations at 1,000 miles a minute, because that's just not who they are they? They can't just change who they are overnight. But I guess what you can do is you can negotiate and say, okay, so I understand. So when I see you and when I'm very excitable, that actually makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And what you want to do is try and retreat. So what I will do is I will, maybe tone down how I speak to you, but actually what would be nice for you is to maybe sort of respond to me, or let me know when I'm getting a little bit, overzealous or overexcited and all that kind of stuff. Because, then that helps maintain the conversation. And yeah, and I guess in a perfect world, all those conversations would go swimmingly. But I guess that's just kind of a bit of a guide as to how to have these conversations with
Yeah.
people who maybe, again, aren't necessarily the worst people in the world, but are probably, you know, rub you up the wrong way for whatever
Yeah.
reason.
I think there's probably just some acceptance as well as that they're not always going to go to plan those
No,
conversations.
no.
And knowing that as well. Now, we didn't get on to narcissists and everyone being a narcissist. I feel that might be another podcast in itself, but
Yeah,
I'm hugely
absolutely.
conscious of time, your valuable and precious time. So the last thing I wanted to ask you, firstly, thank you for all of that, Dan. That was
Sure,
incredibly
thank you.
helpful, I think, especially to people listening, was I think we can all probably agree social media isn't the best place for people to be going for individual advice around their mental
Absolutely.
health.
Yes.
But in terms of you, the clinical work that you do as a practicing psychologist, what is, I mean, there could be many, but two red flags in terms of just two of the many that most people will come across on social media?
Okay. So so the first thing would be people who have sort of answers, absolute answers for things. Like, I guess people who make claims that certain specific, you know, on social media, there's often posts that say, if you do this, it's like a trauma response, or it's because of this kind of thing,
Hmm.
which is not necessarily wrong, but it's also not necessarily 100% true. Like, the behavior that is exhibited could be a result of a numerous amounts of things. So, when I talked about a formulation, and I talked about predisposing factors, and I talked about precipitating factors and all those kind of things, the reason why, the reason that we as human beings come to behave in the way that we are, in our individualistic, idiosyncratic ways, is the way I behave and the way I act, and the path that brought me to how I am is vastly different from your own journey to how you got to where you are. There might be similarities along the way. The experiences that we've had may be similar-ish, but the way in which we've interpreted them, the way that we see the world, the lens through which we see the world will be different and will maybe bear some resemblance, but it won't be exactly the same. So I would sort of treat with, I wouldn't say don't believe it, but I would take it with a pinch of salt. And if it's something that resonates with you, stick with it, but don't take it as gospel. Look into it a bit further, do some digging around, speak to a professional, locally, that you can have a conversation with and to explore that. I'm not saying you necessarily need therapy per se, but if there's somebody that you can have a discussion with about these things or read up about it, then do that. I just wouldn't take everything that's said on social media as gospel, just first and foremost. The second thing that I would look out for, and again, I say this with caution because I don't think that this is what everyone does, but I think if somebody presents you with a problem, or somebody shares information with you that highlights that there is a difficulty or some kind of flaw in your human psyche or the way in which you understand the world or your mental health, and then wants to sell you their services, it just makes me a little bit it
I
just
feel
sits
like
uncomfortably
there's a
with me.
hard relate, especially with what I do, is there's this premise around pain points and leveraging pain, but here's the solution.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
I think this is the thing that I didn't know about social media, because for 2 years ago, because I use social media to take pictures of my food and my dog and my kids and all that kind of stuff, and I used fancy filters, and that was pretty much the extent of social media. However, since sort of starting my account, I've just been exposed to a lot more use of social media, and actually social media is a very, very powerful marketing tool, and I think people use social media for marketing purposes, not necessarily always with malicious intent, but I just feel that sometimes people will use your pain, leverage your pain, create situations or mental health, or pathologize fairly normal behavior, I suppose, and then want to sell you the solution, whether it be through a book, whether it be through a workshop, whether it be through an 8-week program, whether it be through all this kind of stuff. And at the same time, I also hold the fact that access to mental health support is not the best. So I can understand why there is a market. I can understand why there is a gap. I can understand why there is a need. So I don't want to say that people shouldn't be able to access mental health support if they need it. I think there is just something slightly off about people saying there's something wrong with you and I can fix it for this amount of money. And I guess just ethically, it doesn't necessarily sit that well with me. I think if you wanted a therapist, there are loads of private therapists that you could probably find on Google. But then again, so social media is marketing, so it's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword, really.
Yeah. There's access to it, but at the same time, I guess the promise of fixing anything
Yeah,
is something I can certainly
yeah,
think about that from a coaching perspective. Is I can promise all the most educated and well-versed things based on my experience and that
mhm.
individual, but I don't think you can make promises to anyone.
No,
So I'm always cautious of those things. Dan,
yeah.
thank you so much for your valuable time. There's so much of use there, I think, that people get from that. I think it goes without saying, if you've loved this as much as I have, please do subscribe, share with some friends. Dan, for the sake of the listener and where they could possibly go to find out a bit more about you, be exposed to your wonderful content, where do they go?
Oh, thank you very much. I'm humbled by that. But yeah, if you like me, I suppose, you can come find me on Instagram at the psychologist. The.narciss psychologist. Oh, I don't really know what it is, but it's the narciss psychologist on Instagram. I also have a blog, a Substack page where I pretty much write some blogs. My podcast is on there. I've got my own podcast, obviously, because that's what everyone does these days. It's called the Narcissist Ramblings Podcast. So yeah, if you want to come listen to some of my stuff, yeah, that'd be much appreciated. I just wanted to say thanks, Dan. Thanks for the opportunity to have this
Oh,
conversation.
my pleasure.
Yeah, it's really enjoyable.
Thanks so much, mate. I think this is part one of many. Whether I'm putting you in a position now where you can't say no, I don't know. Maybe
Absolutely.
I'll
No, I
ask you
think,
another time.
do you know what? I just think the more it's so I'm all about nuance. I'm all about having conversations that are nuanced, that are expansive, that don't fit neatly into a pastel Instagram carousel. Which is not to say that those don't have benefit as well. Like, again, I'm not trying to bash people who do that. It's just, I think it's great that these conversations are happening online, but I also think they need expanding on. And I think, I think podcasts like this and, conversations that we've had, I think they're helpful. I think they fill in the gray or expand the gray a little bit more, and highlight
Absolutely.
that things aren't necessarily just linear or black and white. So yeah, so if you want to have another chat about things, I will gladly come back.
Absolutely. I will hold you to that. Thanks so much for listening, everyone.